beloved friend. Their leader and teacher had been crucified, and now 3 days later the women bolt through the door early that first Easter morning, telling them that they had received the good news that Christ had risen. And then on the evening of that same day, the disciples gathered behind locked doors. Jesus appears to them and says, "Shalom," which means peace be with you. Shalom was a common greeting in that day, and if you walked through the streets of Jerusalem, you might have heard that word spoken at least 100 times. Shalom. And Jesus says it not once, but twice in his initial surprise visit to his doubting disciples. Perhaps we think maybe he should have been angry with them, that they were not out ministering to the poor and the sick, but he isn't mad at all. He doesn't even appear to be the least bit disappointed in them. Then, as if to give them a blessing, he breathes his resurrection breath on them and commissioned them to go into the world by the power of the very Spirit of God. Have you ever wondered what resurrection breath smells like? Did it smell like the spring flowers that are blossoming all around us? Did it smell like that last meal that he had shared with them the night that he was arrested? Did it smell like the sour wine that he was offered while he was hanging on the cross? Or did it smell like he had been down to the depths of despair, where coal ash and methane and death mingle? Or did it smell of the spices that had been quickly placed on his body before being laid in the tomb? I imagine that resurrection breath smells like hyacinths, perfect peace, abiding, sweet peace, the smell of love perfected. Just as God had breathed the breath into Adam, that first breath, so too does Jesus breathe on his disciples. And after breathing the Spirit into them, they are made new. They're transformed into devoted believers and ministers of the gospel. These gifts of peace and spirit are given to all the disciples of Jesus, including us. Sometimes I think we're not at all that much different than the disciples who were paralyzed by their fears behind those locked doors. I mean, how do we get out of our fears, our own stuck places, and unlock the doors of our hearts and our church to become a more welcoming congregation and a more welcoming individuals of faith? This week we had committee meetings. A couple of committees met and we convened and we talked about the need to reach out to those in our community who are in need, whether it was spiritually or physically or just in need of a warm visit. In another community, we talked about how to meet those needs. We talked about the need to have other people in the congregation other than myself go and visit some people to meet the needs of the visitations. And yet another committee, we talked about how to revitalize the youth program and involve more people in the planning and the preparations of the upcoming Vacation Bible School. By the way, I'm sure Kristen and Tanya would love to hear that some of you are willing to serve again and work again for the Vacation Bible School. But I tell you, with a church this size, it's sometimes hard to keep programs like that going with what seems to be fewer resources, and so our doubts creep in, and we start wondering if we have what it takes to keep the candle burning, the candle of hope and vibrancy, and that infectious love that I talked about with the children. Why is it so hard to embody what we believe and we say is so important for us. Perhaps it is simply because perfectly normal people no longer see a vibrant connection between their faith and the world in which they live, a world that's filled with stress and hatred and tragedies such as the one at the Upper Big Branch. What are we to do in the face of such a contrast of opposites? Well, Jesus says, if you forgive anyone their sins, they will be forgiven. And then he adds, and it's slightly different the way we read it, but in the Greek it actually says, if you hold any one of them, they will be held fast. Now that's an interesting idea. If you hold someone, not their sin, but their wounds, they will be held fast. That means a community of faith such as ours is commissioned by Jesus to forgive sins. That is, you forgive those who hurt you and those you have hurt. And to hold each other fast, meaning to hold them in our hearts and in our prayers and by our actions. The mission that Jesus gives his disciples is the same mission that he was sent to carry out. That is, to forgive those who hurt you and to hold those in your community with compassion and love, just as he forgave and held fast what God sent him to do. Now there's a take-home message for each of us. Forgive one another and hold fast those with whom we are in community. These have been known throughout the Christian tradition as the circle or the office of keys. According to the office of keys, when we forgive, we do not set the ones that we are forgiving free, we set ourselves free. When we focus positively on those to whom we share this church, this community, this world, we retain them as God knows and retains them. Jesus is stating an ancient secret and reminding the disciples that they are given the keys of the kingdom already on earth by the power of the Spirit, forgiving one another and holding them fast. The fearful disciples are then free to become faithful disciples. They would not only preach about Jesus, they would also be Jesus in and for the world. Maybe we all have our doubts, like Thomas, that this whole thing is possible, that Christ is truly alive here and now, or that we have the courage to touch the wounds of the world, or that we have the potential to forgive one another and set ourselves free. The important message here in this passage and in this story is not the message that doubt keeps us from believing, but the invitation to touch and to be touched is what we're to hear. It is the kindness of the Lord who meets us with radical acceptance of who we are just as we are. It is this convergence of doubt and faith that allows Thomas to proclaim his profession of faith in the most convincing way when he says, "My Lord and my God." From the empty tomb to the locked room, Jesus cannot be kept out of our lives any more than water can be kept from running downhill. He did not need to have the stone rolled away in order for him to get out. The stone was rolled away in order for us to see in. The disciples, in their fear, had hoped to keep themselves safe behind locked doors, but Jesus showed up anyway. And now I'm not saying that it's impossible to keep Jesus out of our hearts by steeling them shut